The house looked larger at night, if that was even possible. Rooms stretched away from one another like promises never quite kept. Corridors swallowed sound, until the only thing left in the air was the hum of the central heating and the faint echo of the garden fountain.
Amanda Okoro, who had spent 65 years shaping her life into things that gleamed, companies, estates, foundations, now found that the things she had amassed had a peculiar habit of making noise by their absence. Laughter she hadn't heard in years, arguments she had no one to have them with, the small domestic rituals no one shared anymore. She had expected the world to quiet down with age, not to reopen. That was before Jacob. He smelled like oil and engine grease and the sun off iron. He had a way of speaking that treated problems as if they were repairable, which for a woman who had learned to solve crises with fax machines and shareholders' meetings felt like a small miracle. Their first conversation had been about a stubborn alternator. Their second had been over coffee in his cluttered workshop. Later, when the city seemed exhausted by pretense, Jacob would be the man who made Amanda laugh properly, the man who asked about the hurt under her carefully rehearsed smile and did not look away. Not everyone saw him that way. In the polished rooms where Amanda's friends orbited and where the paper of polite society rarely cracked, Jacob was dissonance. A mechanic from the wrong side of the river, rough hands and a past Amanda didn't share at the club. His presence there made people adjust their napkins, press tighter to their own safe corners of the table. But none of that mattered to Amanda the way it mattered to her daughter. Elena had the Okoro hard line braided into her manner and mannerisms. At 42, she carried both the expectation of being taken seriously and the ease with which a second generation of wealth practices indignation. She had been Amanda's shadow and project since childhood. School trips, wardrobes, partnerships brokered by firms. Where Amanda had built a life of public silences and careful generosity, Elena had learned to speak for the family with a voice that sounded like law. When Amanda and Jacob came to the house together, hand in hand under a mid-May rain, Eleanor met them at the stone steps like a judge she had practiced to be. The carriage lantern threw light across Amanda's hair and carved a darker edge to the lines Eleanor had memorized and resented. Eleanor wore restraint like armor. "You can't be serious," Eleanor said, as if the words themselves might act as a counsel. "You can't be making this public." "I am serious," Amanda answered, and there was something in her voice that surprised her daughter. Not defensiveness, but a calm that had nothing to do with fear. "He is honest, Elena. He is kind." The conversation did not end. It escalated into a dinner where, between courses, Eleanor spoke of consequence, as if enumerating a legal brief. Reputation, potential scandal, the family foundation's board, the inappropriateness of a 65-year-old heiress entangling herself with a man whose hands still told stories he left unsaid. She kept her fingers on the rim of her glass like a metronome. Amanda listened, a small private ache passing across her face. She had always been a woman who kept accounts, of loyalty, of missteps. There were entries for gifts withheld and for small betrayals forgiven. Yet the ledger had been hers, made in years of hard negotiations. Eleanor had never taken her mother's ability to measure hurt. "You have to understand," Elena said at the end of the night, stepping close enough that Amanda could smell the citrus of her perfume and the control in it. "This is not just about you. It will affect the children, the grandchildren. There are optics. There is the board." "Jacob has never met the board," Amanda said, not unkindly. She had known about optics. She had shaped them for decades. Tonight, they felt like the kind of cages she could lift from. Elena's face smoothed into the courteous hardness of someone preparing to file an appeal. "You are one of the most visible figures in the city. A relationship like this—" She stopped, searching for a word that meant more than impropriety. Misogyny coated the syllables and she tasted it with distaste. "Is a liability. You taught me better. Amanda had taught Elena in many ways, but there were lessons she had never tried to impart. Lessons about loneliness and second chances, and the small arithmetic of living out life's last chapters, honestly. She had not expected to be required to teach them now, on a Tuesday evening, while the rain drew lines on the lawn, and Jacob stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who was not sure his welcome had been extended. The argument ended then, with Amanda standing at a window and watching the water flatten. In the years since her husband had died, Amanda had made a fortress of routine. Love, if that was what this was, had not been part of the plan. But then, neither had the shakiness in her chest that later turned out to be nausea. She found herself thinking of small, trivial things, Jacob's laugh, and the knot in the scarf he never could quite get straight. Things that would have once belonged only in the diary of a woman who could have been considered reckless. It was Elena who noticed the pattern first. The way Amanda spoke softer these days, the way she boarded a different car, left at odd times to visit Jacob's garage with ridiculous secrecy, like a young person embarrassed to be seen in love. She followed the receipts. Coffee from a shop Jacob frequented, a sweater in the laundry room that smelled faintly of engine oil. Elena's disapproval calcified into a strategy. That strategy, when it arrived, was not theatrical. It began with small acts, the kind that seemed defensive until they reached the size of betrayal. Elena started by unpicking small public threads, calls to friends, hints in the right ears, a private complaint about Amanda's judgment. She would not, she told herself, be cruel. She would be practical. She sent discreet messages to trustees and the family lawyer about the risk of Amanda's recent choices. A seed of doubt, so easy to plant in the soil of old alliances, took root. Amanda, unaware that a war was being plotted among the fine china, grew larger with an odd inward light. The nausea became certain. The midwife's test peaked a week later in a tiny gilded envelope. Positive. Amanda's breath left her as if the world had tilted. At 65, with a life that had been carefully mapped, and with corporate calendars that had been her longitude, she had become a woman with a new and urgent map to a tiny human being. The news did not stay private. News rarely did in Amanda's life. Photographers tried to catch a shot of a grandmotherly billionaire in a tender domestic frame, and found instead a woman who had lived long enough to see her cheeks filled with something more than sorrow. The tabloids wrote of the unlikely pregnancy as if it were a seasonal curiosity. The board debated in hush-hush rooms whether it would hurt donations or invite litigation. Elena's voice, steady and infuriatingly reasonable, became the chorus of caution in rooms that had been hers to command. Amanda refused to surrender the joy because it was inconvenient. "Maybe you'll be a fool," Elena said once, when Amanda had sat in the parlor with a scan photograph folded in her hands. "But your choices ripple." "Then let them ripple, Elena," Amanda answered, and for a moment the two women sat with their different currencies exposed. A mother with a new, tender investment of hope, and a daughter who had been made manager of that hope without ever being asked. If the beginning was soft and patient, the escalation was not. Elena moved into motion that had the efficiency of a board meeting. She drafted allies, made calls to people who had power where hers did not, and economized cruelty as if it were a necessary resource. It is one thing to give force to a complaint. It is another to begin to arrange the world to corroborate it. Elena did both. She used the family's name like a hammer. She convinced the house staff that Amanda's choices endangered the family line, and where persuasion failed, she nudged suspicion until it snapped into action. She recruited those she thought she could trust. Her son, Chisholm, called the way most people call when they want advantage. He and his sister Emma were useful in the household, not because of any cohesion of affection, but because of their willingness to do tasks Elena could not feasibly perform herself, shadowing Jacob, leaving small threats like wet footprints on his stoop, subtly sabotaging deliveries to the garage so that he would be late to planned dates. They learned quickly how to be invisible in the ways that matter. Jacob did not notice the scheme in its early stages. When someone left a note on his van warning him to stop calling Amanda, he threw the paper in the bin and laughed it off. When a client refused to pay because of rumors, he tightened his belt and joked about the absurdity of celebrity. He loved Amanda, but love is not immunity against the pressures of a poorer world where rumors are a tax you can ill afford. Once, late in the night, he was found with a split lip in an alley near the garage. He told the police he had fallen. He told Amanda he had been mugged. He did not tell the truth, that a man with a smile like a cipher had told him to stop seeing the woman who had changed the direction of his life. Elena had other contacts. There was a man who preferred to remain a shadow in hospital corridors, a doctor with a practiced smile who could make small problems vanish from paperwork. Dr. Admi prided himself on discretion. His ward was a quiet place in a city where the quiet cost money, and money had always been one of Elena's more persuasive arguments. The first time they met, she brought him documents folded into a leather portfolio and a look that did not seek his moral counsel. She was not cruel to him, only transactional. "We need assurance," she said, "for the good of the family." He watched the lines of her face the way a man reads a page of text. "Assurance of what, Ms. Okoro?" "That nothing unfortunate will follow my mother's choice. That if complications occur, they do not become a scar on the family name." She sketched her finger along the portfolio, as if outlining a map. Dr. Admi chose not to ask the question that would have landed the conversation back in ethics. He chose instead to ask, with a professional blandness, about protocol, and then to suggest logistical possibilities, none of which he described in detail. He nodded at phrases like contingency and discretion, the way a man nods at technical jargon he knows will land on the right ears. When Elena left his office with an envelope thicker than a bill and colder than cash, Dr. Admi folded the corner of a page into his palm, like a prayer he had not meant to utter. Amanda never met Dr. Admi. She met breath and pain, and the midwives who held her hand and told her to breathe. Jacob sat in the chair near the sterile light, his hands shaking in a way that betrayed his fear more than his toughness. When labor started, the hospital was kind in its efficiency, and not unkind in its tone. There were forms and monitors. There were the little jokes made by people who do this work all the time in rooms where life is traded like a commodity. There was also, in the periphery, a sense that something was being orchestrated elsewhere. The day the baby came, the world narrowed for Amanda into a single, bright tunnel. She had imagined such moments in palettes of light and shadow, a child at her knee, a family renewed. In the delivery room, the only thing that mattered was breath and the small mechanical calculations of pain. Jacob gripped her hand. He said her name like a benediction. The nurse told her to push, then to breathe. It was work, and it was miracle in small measures. There were hands who moved in the nursery afterward, hands that performed the solemn choreography of the ward. There were photographs taken under fluorescent light, little slips of paper with names that might become future keepsakes. In the blur between relief and exhaustion, Amanda reached for the new being pressed to her chest and felt only a vast, aching tenderness, a sense of surrender and culmination. The baby was there, and Amanda's skin recognized the weight of it, like someone rediscovering an instrument. And then, the baby did not open its eyes. Amanda's breath stuttered into something like confusion, and then fear. The midwife's voice changed tone, not in panic, but in an alertness that felt underwater. "We should run more tests," she murmured. Sometimes the eyes respond later. It was a hospice leap from hope to the smallest fear, from newborn cooing to the hush that comes when professionals exchange notes behind gloved hands. Amanda, awake in a new and fragile twilight, trusted them. She had lived long enough to let professionals steer landscapes of grief and celebration before. She did not know she was holding the wrong child. Outside the nursery, Elena watched with a composure that had been trained by years of boardrooms and lesser cruelties. She had timed her presence exactly, her face composed to show concern, her voice a model of filial devotion. She had been in the hospital corridor, making sure that the right doors were open and the right people were positioned. If anyone were to later call her presence anything other than simple family interest, she would be ready with a list of those she had consoled. Her triumph, when it came to her, tasted of clean success. After hours of testing and promises of follow-up, Amanda left the hospital with a small bundle under her arm and a chill in her bones she thought was simply from exhaustion. Jacob had insisted on driving them home himself, holding the baby in the back seat like the weight of their new future. He looked at Amanda, the way a man looks at a rare and dangerous thing that has just become his responsibility. On the evening in the house that smelled of lemon oil and polished wood, Amanda moved through rooms that had been empty for years and set the small bundle in the cradle she had had delivered a week before, a cradle chosen the way you might choose a votive, with all the solemnity of someone making space for a miracle. She washed her hands and hummed a lullaby, a song she remembered from a childhood long before money, a song that had been more about persistence than bedtime. When she lifted the baby from the cradle that night and checked the tiny hands and feet, she found herself looking for the little interplay of light in the eyes that she had once seen in children. The eyes were closed. They stayed closed. Amanda tried to soothe herself with the knowledge of medical common sense. Sometimes sleep is deep. Sometimes newborns are slow. Yet as the hours stretched, an undercurrent of unease threaded through her like a cold fish. She called the hospital twice. She called the midwife. Each time she was reassured, eyes will open, give it time. The house remained large and silent except for the sound of the baby breathing and the distant, muffled radio the staff left on for her. Jacob fell asleep on the sofa, his jaw clenched, his hands raw with tension. Amanda sat by the nursery door as dawn bled into morning and listened to the flat, fragile breaths. She began the slow, terrible work of cataloging the facts of her life. She had been a mother before. She knew the difference between fuss and something that did not obey the logic of routine. When morning turned thin and a nurse came by to check the baby, Amanda asked the one question that upended the quiet of the house. "What is the baby's blood type?" The nurse paused, and then gave the answer with the soft assurance of someone trained to wash away panic with facts. A common type. Nothing to worry about. It should have been simple. But Amanda, who had spent decades in boardrooms parsing contracts and clauses, started to assemble a different kind of ledger. She remembered lines from the prenatal forms. She remembered minor conversations in the hospital corridor. Her mind sketched a map and then mistrusted its owners. She asked for records. The administrator, nursing staff, and the midwife complied, as they had to. But paperwork has a way of being both reassuring and revealing. In a corner of the hospital, where cameras kept watch for the public good and staff went about their duties, nothing is ever truly private. There are footprints, deliveries, faces that are not always the ones they appear to be. Elena had known this. She had prepared for chaos by calling on those whose loyalty was limited to the amount of a bank transfer. A doctor who kept his ledger separate from his oath could, in the hazy hours of a busy shift, choose convenience over conscience. A shift supervisor pressed by the right phone call could misplace a file. A nurse, exhausted, could look the other way. Amanda did not know any of that yet. She only knew that when she lifted the baby to her chest, the weight felt familiar and foreign in the same instant. She called Elena, and for the first time since the pregnancy showed, asked for the daughter's help, in translating the practicalities of care. Which specialists, which clinics, what next? Elena came immediately, arriving in a quiet car and moving with an air of efficiency that masked a triumphant quiet. She sat beside Amanda and offered her hand and a composed face. "This will pass," Elena said, in the voice of someone offering a placebo that looks like an antidote. "We'll get the best." Amanda wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe, with the deep, sometimes desperate longing of a parent, that the small crisis they faced could be solved with kindness and money. In her hands, the baby slept like a small, perfect knot, and Amanda imagined all the ways she would make that life a certain and blessed thing. There were other things Amanda did not anticipate. The small warehouse of watchfulness Elena kept at the house, the way the family lawyer began to ask questions in a tone that felt like collection. She did not foresee, and could not, the private ledger Elena had already been keeping, where each signature and public apology was an asset to be turned into advantage. When Amanda fell asleep at last, with the baby curled on her breast, she dreamed of lullabies and machines. The house breathed around them, content in its own spaciousness. In the quiet corridor outside the nursery, Elena watched them while the lamp on her phone cast a pale blue light. She photographed the scene once, a sterile, color-corrected image to be kept as proof that she had been dutiful. Then she slid the phone back into her pocket and thought of the ledger again, of the neatness of outcomes, of the stubbornness of people. That night, in a garage cooled by the morning, Jacob sat alone and thought of how quickly a life with promise could be complicated. He loved Amanda. He had said it, halting and true. But love in a world where names carry weight is often not enough. A week earlier, when a man he couldn't identify had left a bruise on his cheek, Jacob had sat on a curb and let the rain wash at his jaw. He had looked at his own hands, hands that fitted wrenches and replaced alternators, and wondered if their capability was a sin in some architecture of privilege. He wondered if, when confronted with scandal, he would step forward like a man or shrink back like a footnote. When he finally went to the hospital to see Amanda after delivery, he felt like a guest at something he had inadvertently become a part of. He washed his hands until they were numb and sat by the bed, letting Amanda's warmth fill the spaces he had never known how to inhabit. There was a softness in him that did not agree with being a spectacle. He wanted to protect this new small life, but he also wanted to protect himself, an instinct that would, over time, make him liable to mistakes he could not afford. The first week turned in on itself, like the first few pages of a book that will not be stopped. There were late-night appointments and whispering nurses, and Elena's steady presence at the parlor door. Amanda was both elated and wary. She had lived long enough to understand how quickly fortune's surface could crack. She wrote notes, made lists, called an old friend in pediatrics, arranged for a home nurse. She took to folding the small sweater Jacob had bought and breathing it in as if the scent of oil could anchor the life blooming in her. Elena, meanwhile, assembled small facts into a dossier. Stock market blips that might follow a scandal, a donor who had hinted at withdrawal, the uncomfortable rumor thread the tabloids had begun to pull. Facts, when gathered, become force. She moved through them like a woman putting coins into a machine with a desired outcome. She told herself that her methods were necessary, that Amanda's capacity for distraction could damage the legacy that had been entrusted to Elena's stewardship. She rehearsed arguments about dignity and prudence, and did not allow herself to feel the weight of the ethical precipice she had long ago begun to cross. A fortnight after the birth, a call from the hospital's medical records office landed like a pebble in Amanda's lap. There had been a clerical review, someone explained. The nurse on duty had requested another check after noticing a discrepancy. Amanda's stomach tightened. At first, the discrepancy was described as small, Paperwork needed a signature, a barcode out of place. But then a second call mentioned another thing. A note in the maternity log that suggested the possibility of mislabeling in the nursery. Amanda's world reoriented. The elegant rooms of the house, which had previously hummed with a comfortable domesticity, now felt like someone had switched the panels, revealing maze walls and echoes. She asked for the hospital footage. The administrative assistant balked. Cameras in such wards were supposed to be a protection, she said, but they were also the kind of resource the hospital resisted releasing. Amanda suspected for the first time that she had been surrounded by people who might not put her life at the center of truth. When she asked Elena about it, Elena's face was composed, but her eyes were quick. "It's probably nothing, Mother," she said. "These things happen in busy wards. Paperwork is human. I will help you get to the bottom of it." "There is a human cost if what you say is true," Amanda said, gently but with an edge. "If there has been a mistake—" "A mistake is different from scandal," Elena replied. She placed a hand on Amanda's fingers. Her glance flicked to the baby, to the closed eyelids, to Jacob's sleeping profile on the sofa. "We can manage a mistake. We cannot manage chaos." Amanda closed her eyes and felt the old river of finance and power run beneath her. She thought of how often she had negotiated with that river and how often it had accepted her terms. She had no immediate answer for what to do. What she did have was a distrust she had not yet been able to name, and a slow, resolving intent to find out what had happened in the brightly lit nursery where she had first held a child who would one day call her mother. If this is getting under your skin, stay with the story. There are places where privilege bends the shapes of truth, and there are people who will not let that bending ruin them without a fight. The fight, when it began, would not be a single roar. It would be 1,000 small adjustments to an environment that none of them really controlled. Elena moved more quietly now, like a hand rehearsing a lock. She arranged meetings with the right people and sent polite notes to those who had any sway. She made sure the hospital had what it required to make Amanda patient. She made sure the right faces were in the right rooms, and someone in the nursery moved between cribs when the lights were low, and the cameras, for reasons the hospital would later explain with the apologetic calm of institutions, had been repositioned. The film of the night, grainy for a moment indecipherable, would later show nothing more than a sedate shift worker passing down a corridor, the silhouette of a hand appearing in a frame and then leaving. It would show the wrong child being lifted in one arm and the other set aside. It would later be described in cold legal language as a lapse, a misidentification, and in less guarded speech as a calculated choice. On that night, Amanda's world held a new ache and a new tenderness. She focused on the small breath of the infant in her arms like someone who had found, at last, a reason to accept the risk of loving again. Jacob, meanwhile, began to feel the currents pull back. He was pressed at work, then at the corners of his apartment. His friends advised discretion. Keep away from the house when tempers flared. The bruises on his jaw faded, but the rumor did not. He loved Amanda and would do anything to protect her. He also owned the knowledge that in a fight between a family like the Okoros and a man who mended engines, the latter organism rarely prevailed. His fear was not for himself alone. It was for the child sleeping in a bassinet in a mansion that hummed with a life he had never known how to navigate. After the night that had carved a new trajectory into all their lives, the mansion settled into a new pattern. Amanda held the baby and wondered. Elena watched and planned. Jacob drifted between hope and a fear that would later become his enemy. In the house, there were whispers that could be catalogued. A nurse's offhand comment, a page missing on a chart, a security guard's memory of someone arriving late and leaving early. None of it, at first, pointed to a single conclusion. It only collected like snow on a lawn, light and then heavy, and then dangerous. Amanda did not yet know what had been set into motion. She woke each morning to the small, persistent breath of the child she thought was hers, and read those breaths like a continual prayer. She sang the lullaby Jacob had taught her, and felt, in the feel of the fabric under her palm, the odd truth that motherhood can be a site of both claim and surrender. She could not have imagined then that another child, somewhere in a hostel of cinder-block walls and tin roofs, was being folded into a life of different kinds of resourcefulness, or that years later a photograph and a sample of blood would decide more than an afternoon's confusion. At the edge of her life, in the quiet rooms and private boardrooms, Elena began to feel the first cold stirrings of a triumph that would come to look differently in the light of truth. She did not imagine the hurt she would cause as anything more than a necessary casualty. She had convinced herself that the household and the family's future required what she planned. It was, to her, an act of protection disguised as discipline. Amanda would not remain ignorant forever. The small misalignments that the city registers as rumor have a way of adding up into evidence. The hospital's cameras, the stubbornness of a midwife with a conscience, the pattern of envelopes shifting hands, all of these had a trajectory that would one day collide with the truth. But that day was not yet here. For now there was rocking and quiet, and the small miracle of a human sleeping against her chest. Night settled again over the mansion. The fountain in the courtyard sighed in its mechanical way. Amanda folded the blanket over the baby's feet and kissed its brow. For all her wealth, she felt suddenly and utterly poor in such a way that felt honest. The poverty of not knowing whether the life in her arms belonged to her in the simplest biological sense. She did not know she had been robbed of more than certainty. She did not know that the act of being given a child whose eyes did not open was, for someone else, an engineered success. And so, in a house that had been built on careful plans and carefully hidden compromises, a new life began on a foundation of unspoken things. Outside, the city breathed in its separate rhythms. Inside, people made choices that would ripple farther than they imagined. In time, those ripples would either be leveled by truth or swallowed in the restive currents of privilege. And in time, Amanda would have to turn from the small, faithful work of keeping a child warm to the larger, colder labor of seeking answers. For now, her hands were full, and her heart beat loud enough to believe in the simple miracle it held. Days folded into years in ways that were almost merciless. The hush of the mansion grew familiar. The heavy curtains were drawn more often, not out of secrecy, but as if shielding an old wound from sunlight. Amanda learned the little routines that made a household livable on the far side of grief. The times when the housekeeper preferred to clean the west wing, the particular hour Jacob would call if he was running late, the exact cadence of the nurse's afternoon report. She learned to gauge the small changes in the blind child's breathing as if they were weather reports. Peter, named because Amanda had always liked the sound of a name that wasn't gilded, settled into the rhythms of the home with the trust of a child who had no context for the mechanics of status. He knew the layout by texture and sound, the rough seam of the parlor rug, the narrow step under the arch into the library, the soft thud of Amanda's slippers when she came to his room at night. He learned lullabies the way he learned to navigate, by ear, by repetition, by the warmth his mother offered without hesitation. He became, in all practical ways, Amanda's son. Outside the house, other calculations were being made. Elena's network hummed along, trustees reassured, donors placated, murmurs about the fragility of reputation traded for pledges of continued support. Elena's face, when photographed at a gallery opening or charity luncheon, was the same measured public instrument it had always been. She performed remorse when required, steeled defiance when necessary. Privately, she busied herself with contingencies, a delayed press release, a quiet transfer of shares to a trust, a few well-timed gifts to influential people who might prefer the narrative of protective daughter rather than criminal mastermind if things ever leaked. She also kept pieces in motion that were not on paper. Chisholm and Emma, her children, both sharp and practiced at translating entitlement into small cruelties, became useful hands in a project that needed hands. They learned, as Elena had, the economy of invisible tasks, interrupting a delivery, misplacing a file, laughing cruelly as they passed a nursery door. They were never alone in their work. There was always a string of excuses, a whisper of pressure applied by someone else, phone calls to suppliers, a well-placed hint to a clerk. It was never direct violence. It was instead the slow, grinding pressure of social breaks that wore down resistance until people stepped off the road of their own accord. Jacob's presence became more sporadic. He loved Amanda, but he loved survival too. There were months when engine work demanded extra hours. There were moments when the smell of oil in his hair felt like a visible blight in rooms that were habitually powdered with perfume. Rumors had a way of cutting wages. Clients reneged on jobs they considered risky. He found himself doing sums he had never done before, how much a lawyer's consultation would cost, whether it was wiser to avoid the house for a week. Fear shadowed his tenderness, and sometimes eclipsed it. He did not entirely know how to be a protector in a world where the enemy carried a family name. The years that followed took a shape that might have been novel to anyone who had not watched privilege bend its will against consequence. Peter grew duteous and cheerful in the ways small children are, pleased by tidy things, interested in the sound of Amanda's voice. He learned the broad, soft letters of the home through touch and tune. He also learned how to be careful with people whose kindness was conditional and whose smiles sometimes contained other agendas. The staff learned to treat him with a mixture of reverence and performative tenderness, practices that Amanda noticed and quietly corrected when she could. Philip, by contrast, grew in a world that was narrow and loud and cunning. The orphanage where he landed was an institution of necessity rather than nurture. Concrete floors warmed only by the sun that made it through small, high windows. Volunteers who arrived with good intentions but thin schedules. Caregivers who split their time as best they could. He was given a different language to convert into survival. Hunger taught him what pride had not. Reading became a way to measure the world outside his walls. He discovered an appetite for questions, how maps were made, why certain people spoke with sharp edges, which doors led where. His intelligence was an instrument he learned to hide, so as not to attract the jealous or the cruel. Philip also learned of absence in ways children do. The empty place in calendars where birthdays should be noted. The slow accumulation of photographs of other families on the walls he could not lean into. He found small mentors in unexpected staff members, a librarian who stayed after hours and helped him butcher through encyclopedias one dusty page at a time, a teacher who taught him to diagram sentences and then to shape the universe into orderly terms. He learned, too, the economy of secrecy, how to make inquiry a private act, how to ask the right question to the right person, and then let the answer ferment like a hidden note until he could use it. Around year 3, there was a small fracture in Elena's control. A nurse in the maternity ward, one of the younger staff who had resented the intersection of money and favors more than she let herself admit, had carried an uneasy conscience for a long time. She had watched, in the glow of fluorescent lights, the way envelopes changed hands, and how a certain doctor lingered a little too long in corridors. She had come from a family that prized honesty in a blunt way, and had not yet learned how to bend her ethics into the more practical forms of silence that hospitals rewarded. One afternoon she called Amanda directly, under the pretext of a routine check-in. She spoke with a tenderness that was not performative. "Mrs. Okoro," she said in a voice that trembled slightly, "there were irregularities. Someone noted mislabeling in the log the night of your delivery. The supervisor said it was a clerical error. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry if this causes you pain." Amanda listened. The words settled like stones. She thanked the nurse politely, and then did a thing that in her profession came naturally. She documented. She asked for records in writing. She kept the nurse's voicemail with the little crack of human fear in it. She began to keep dates. The smallest evidence, she had learned, could become a bridge to truth. Months later, a cleaner found a tiny device under the bassinet where Peter slept. It was the kind of small, flat object people use to track packages. The cleaner had been aware of it, like someone aware of a paperclip on a floor, uselessly present. When she mentioned it to the house manager, the manager told no one at first. The impulse to shield a family's private life is strong where people live on wages that must be protected. But the device's presence lodged like a splinter. Under the right light, it was suspicious. Bought by a phone transaction that traced back to a small electronics shop where someone with Chisholm's face had asked for cash and no receipt. When Amanda saw the device, an odd, quiet fury rose in her. It was not only the violation of privacy, but the way someone had assumed ownership over her fear. She sat in the study with the device on the desk between the ledgers she still kept for habit, and she felt the ledger tilt. It had been, in many ways, Eleanor who had built those briefings, those quiet notes to staff. It had been Eleanor who had the motive and the means. Amanda did not jump to accusation. She moved according to the harsh arithmetic she had learned long ago. Small facts collected over time become proof. Before long, she began to accrue more small facts. A security guard remembered seeing Chisholm loiter outside the hospital for an afternoon when the deliveries came in. A former hospital administrator, paid handsomely to keep quiet, left in a huff, and later, in a moment of candor, with a friend who owed the hospital years of favor, mentioned an envelope handed across a table. A volunteer from the orphanage, someone who had once worked briefly at the hospital, mentioned a name. Dr. Admi, a man known in certain circles to be practical about problems. Amanda could have moved slowly, hiding the edges of her inquiry. Instead, she moved with the deliberate speed of someone who had spent her life in decisive negotiations. She hired a lawyer, not for litigation, but for information. The lawyer arranged for quiet requests for footage, for chain of custody forms that the hospital could not easily refuse. When the hospital resisted, the lawyer applied pressure in the manner of legal notices and calm language that promised public exposure if cooperation failed. Dr. Admi, when the request came, did not meet it with calm. He met it with the sort of panic that speaks of a ledger unbalanced. He had built a life of small transactions, fast corrections, neat signatures. In the months after, as the investigation sketched the pattern of coin and decision, he found himself cornered by his own compromises. The hospital, which had once been a place of quiet privileges, began to look like a map of many places where ethics had been shelved for convenience. He called people. He offered explanations that sounded plausible enough in private. But the footage, once coerced into light by the lawyer's insistence, did not care for explanations. The film, grainy, the color drained by poor lighting, was the instrument that finally severed Elena's careful threads. It showed a corridor in the indeterminate hour after midnight. It showed a nurse with a tired gait. It showed a hand at a crib, and then another hand lifting one infant and carrying it out of frame. The action there was not theatrical. It was mechanical, practiced. The motion of the hands spoke of a plan performed by someone who had rehearsed contingency. Amanda watched the footage with Jacob at her side, his arm stiff around her back, like a makeshift brace. Her face, for once, betrayed a hardness that was not grief, but resolve. When the footage was shown in a cautious legal setting, the grainy pixels were cross-referenced with purchase records, with security logs and staffing sheets. The paper trail wove outward like a spider's web. A receipt from a small clinic, a phone record tying a number to an envelope, a credit entry on Dr. Admi's account. These added up. Elena was implicated, not as a random face in a crowd, but as the one who had paid for the conveniences that made the swap possible. Her signature appeared on an authorization form for a private consultation the night of the birth. The sort of euphemism that covers a multitude of discrepancies. Elena reacted like someone whose life had taught her to expect resistance and to overcome it with explanation. Her first impulse was to perform dignity. She appeared at a press conference with tears that seemed timed and a voice measured for effect. "I would never harm my mother," she told the cameras, the line practiced enough that even the reporters who mistrusted her were taken for a second by the image of filial devotion. She blamed a series of cloaked errors and rogue employees. She promised cooperation. But fingerprints, both literal and figurative, are not easily wiped. Chisholm and Emma were called in for interviews. Dr. Adme's bank account was examined. The orphanage's records were subpoenaed, and the volunteers who had nothing left to lose began to speak. It was one of those volunteers, a young woman who had taught Philip to read and who had grown fond of his thin, intense curiosity, who told the police about a child who had come to the orphanage under a strange arrangement. A name changed, a file that had a different notation, a man who had signed as a volunteer and never returned. The police moved with the kind of formal restraint that sometimes masks and slow-moving outrage. Arrest warrants were drawn. Elena was called in and served. The moment of her handcuffing was not cinematic. It was cold, bureaucratic, inevitable. Cameras flashed as she was led past the driveway she had once used to host fundraisers. Her face, which had been so adept at wearing emotion like ceremonial wear, lost some of its practiced sheen. The public, always hungry for a fall, loosed its own calculus. For every defender who insisted on procedural caution, there were others who insisted on ruin. If Elena's downfall was public, Dr. Adme's descent was quieter and more abject. The man who had once prided himself on discretion watched as his career collapsed into the courtroom. He offered explanations, a moment of weakness, a lapse of judgment, but explanations are little consolation to those who consider their children stolen. He pleaded guilty to a suite of charges that read on paper like the moral ledger he had refused to keep in practice: conspiracy to commit child trafficking, falsifying medical records, accepting bribes. His sentence would come later. For now, there was the immediate, personal humiliation of his name, linked to a crime that seemed to bleed the hospital's reputation. Chisholm and Emma found that the small cruelties they had practiced had grown into criminal acts in the eyes of the law. Acts that had once been meant to intimidate now read differently under oath: coercion, complicity in kidnapping, harassment. The volunteers' demeanors, the shaky staff testimonies, the receipts, all these small things, once scattered like dust, came together like a portrait. Jacob, when he was asked to testify, found himself facing memories that were sharper than he liked. He had, in private, been ashamed of his silences. He had chosen safety for himself in a world that valued his discretion less than his service. He had been frightened by the man who had beaten him in the alley. He had been intimidated by money and the threats it can quietly deliver. He had not told Amanda everything then, partly out of cowardice and partly out of not wanting to be the bringer of more pain. Now, sitting under oath, he told the truth in a voice that trembled but did not break. He admitted being scared, admitted to avoiding the house sometimes, admitted that fear had dictated choices that he regretted. He spoke, too, of his love for Amanda, of the nights he had spent in the garage crying into oily rags. His testimony was raw. It was also, in some ways, a kind of redemption. The legal machinery did not deliver instant comfort. An arrest is not the same as closure. Court dates loomed, charges were issued. Public opinion moved between pity and righteous indignation. There were interminable hearings about custody and liability, and the less glamorous business of filing forms to change names and rights. But there was also a practical, immediate shift. One small boy who had been in a dirty cot in an orphanage was suddenly listed, on paper and in the heart, as Amanda Okoro's biological son. When Philip was brought to the Okoro mansion for the first time since the night his fate had been arranged, he came like a person walking into a foreign house and trying not to tremble. He was 6, but the shape of his intelligence made him seem older. He scanned rooms like a man who had been practicing reading faces. The house smelled the way memory does, lemon and polish, and the faint chemical tang of institutional disinfectant when new things are brought in. Amanda met him in the high-ceilinged foyer with a careful, contained tenderness. He looked at her and for a long time said nothing. "Hello, Philip," Amanda said, and her voice had the quiet, certain weight of someone trying to get a damaged instrument in tune. "My name is Amanda. She stopped, realizing that titles and shapes mattered to him less than steadiness. "I'm here," she finished simply. "I'm here to be with you." He took a step forward, and then another, and then rested a hand against the carved banister as if it were a map of the way he should move. He tested the plushness of veiled carpets with his shoes, found the staircase, and asked in the single, level voice of a child who had learned to measure everything by its utility, "Where will I sleep?" "You can sleep wherever you like," Amanda answered. She offered him the kind of choice she had long spared herself, small freedoms that were gigantic to a child. "Tonight, you decide." The household, for its part, folded awkwardly into new patterns. Staff, who had been loyal to Elena because she had always been decisive, now deferred to Amanda, and where they had once rehearsed lies, they now rehearsed the truth. There were practicalities to be arranged, medical checks, appointment with specialists, but Amanda insisted on a pace that prioritized Philip's adjustment rather than public display. She did not parade him at parties as a trophy of discovery. She fed him simple things he liked and let him explore the house on his own terms. The gulf between the orphanage and the mansion was wide in material terms, but Amanda tried to bridge it with consistent presence. She read with him. She taught him to tell time with a clock made tactile by her fingers. She let him ask questions and never answered pretentiously. Philip began slowly to unfurl. Peter's place in this new geography required careful tending as well. He was not a cipher to be replaced by a biological claim. He had loved and had been loved. He had known Amanda as mother for years. When officials came to brief Amanda on custody possibilities, she listened to the legal arguments and then turned her own moral compass by hand. She had, in those years, loved Peter with a fullness that had become part of the architecture of the house. She could not, ethically or emotionally, hand him away. Amanda's decision to keep both boys was not a sentimental flourish. It was a chosen, difficult posture. She arranged, through counsel and with the patience she had always had for business negotiations, to open a legal path for Philip's recognition and custody that did not erase Peter's rights. There were long hearings where arguments were made by lawyers and where the judge's face remained inscrutable. Elena's defense tried to argue that Amanda's decisions had been clouded by age, by weakness, by maternal infatuation. The prosecution argued that Elena had orchestrated a crime motivated by wealth and fear. In the public square, everyone had an opinion. In the confines of the courtroom, the law had its own slow, deliberate speech. When the judge finally delivered a series of interim orders, allowing Philip's physical return to Amanda, but mandating an assessment of both children's welfare and a permanent custody hearing at a later date, it was not a dramatic exoneration. It was, however, a formal acknowledgement that the law would not treat innocence as expendable. Amanda, who had once made mergers and acquisitions with the same hand she now used to braid hair, understood the complexity. She had her son back, but she also had a duty to protect a child who had been stolen in order that a paper might look cleaner. Elena, meanwhile, rehearsed different defenses. She spoke to reporters with something like cramped dignity, and she gave interviews crafted to emphasize fear for the family's future rather than malice. At times, she tried to meet Amanda's eyes and misread them for weakness, as if she believed that being the daughter gave her natural priority. But priority in law and priority in grief are separate things. Her arrest became, for many, the visible imprint of privilege gone corrupt. She stood accused of offenses that, in the eyes of people who had watched the cruelty of social power, seemed to explain too much about the way wealthy families trade human life like ledger entries. There were, in the aftermath, losses that money could not cover. Family members turned away or spoke on the record with bitter clarity. Donors faltered. Boards reorganized. Chisholm and Emma found professional doors closing. Dr. Admi was removed from practice and publicly shamed in a way that once would have been avoided by the hospital's carefully controlled PR. Yet punishment, however necessary, did not simply stitch the torn fabric of two small boys' lives overnight. Jacob, for his part, survived the crisis by learning how to be braver in small ways. He began, after months of reflection, by going to groups for people who had been intimidated by wealth. He listened to others' stories of being pushed around and learned to see himself not as a foil, but as someone who owed not only money, but time and presence. He went to the court hearings and sat in the back, watching the faces of those who testified, some of whom had once been his co-workers. His testimony, honest and blunt, had become a force for truth. After it was over, he sat with Amanda in the car outside the courthouse, and they did not speak for a long time. When they did, their conversation was made of practicalities, therapy appointments, school registration, how to teach a child that the world could be both cruel and fair. The hardest nights were those where Amanda sat in her study and waited for dreams to leave him, for the memory of the swapped babies to stop mingling with business memos. She loved both boys. She had been robbed of certainty and had fought to recover it. Her fights had taken down people she had once been proud to call family. She was not moved by the idea of vengeance. She was moved by the idea of repair. She set up counseling for both children and for staff. She built a small room in the East Wing, away from the public eye, where the boys could be taught together and separately, where sight and sound could be met with professionals who had been vetted for integrity rather than convenience. There was also a quiet moral reckoning she had to survive. There were nights when she imagined the children, years earlier, sleeping in different beds, and thought of the person who had held a child, not biologically his own, for 6 years, and how love can form under false premises, but still be true. What makes a mother? She had once wondered aloud to Jacob. Now she had answer in practice. Presence, fidelity, the willingness to be accountable for the life you hold. The law might reclaim bodies. The heart must claim the work. Publicly, the city watched as Elena went on trial. The prosecution presented the footage, the bribes, the chain of communications. Witnesses, some compelled by subpoena, some led by conscience, spoke of envelopes and whispered deals. The defense painted a narrative of fear and management gone wrong, but the weight of evidence was a thing little words could move. The jury deliberated and found Elena guilty on several counts: conspiracy, coercion, and complicity in child trafficking among them. Sentencing would come later, after appeals, but the verdict was an index of public judgment. When Elena was finally escorted from the courthouse, her face was slack with a new kind of exhaustion. She had always been the daughter who thought she had the right to steer outcomes. Now she felt the full, stubborn gravity of consequences. Amanda did not celebrate. Revenge had never been her intention. She had wanted truth, and that was what had come. The cost of truth in this case was vast and complicated. Philip adjusted to the mansion in ways that surprised Amanda. He exhibited a hunger for ordinary things: a slow morning with toast, a cat to prod and name, a desk where his pencils had their place. He asked practical questions about school and how to write a check, and he listened intensely when Amanda read to him in the evenings. Peter, for his part, watched Philip with curiosity and a cautious friendship, sometimes jealous, but usually gracious. The two boys taught each other the contours of family in small acts, sharing a toy car, learning to climb the library stairs together with hands on the banister. Amanda watched them with a fierce tenderness, and a knowledge that this injunction of love required constant tending. There were moments, sharp, tender, where the house breathed differently. On a Sunday afternoon when it was too cold to be outside, the three of them sat in the parlor listening to an old record and making up nonsense lyrics. Philip surprised them by humming a tune he had learned in the orphanage and then laughing as if at some private joke. Jacob, who had come more fully into the household by then, tuned up a small radio and argued gently over the proper volume. The life they made was, in its ordinary ways, the repair they had all chosen. Legal repercussions continued. Dr. Adme received a sentence of several years and was barred from practice. Chisholm and Emma faced penalties that affected their futures in less public, but no less real ways. Loss of professional connections, fines, community service mandated as part of restorative measures. Elena's sentence was less immediate due to appeals and the entanglements of wealthy counsel, but the verdict remained a public marker of her culpability. Amanda used her resources, as she always had, for a different kind of influence. She set up a small fund to support the orphanage Philip had come from, and invested in programs to train staff in infant identification protocols and record-keeping. She met with hospital administrators and demanded systemic changes, better chain of custody for newborns, stricter audit trails, more oversight for those with access to nurseries. Money, she had learned, could be used as a shield, but also as a leverage for rectification. The city, fascinated by the scandal, followed the story with the usual cycles of outrage and forgetfulness. There were opinion pieces, Sunday panel discussions about moral decay among the wealthy, and a few earnest columns on the resilience of love. But Amanda lived outside much of that noise. Her life had been cracked open in a way that exposed both tenderness and failing. She rebuilt as best she could, with patience, and with the same strategic care she had always used in business. Only now the metrics were not profit, but children's well-being. On the day the two boys were both photographed together, one blind, one newly arrived, the image circulated with a mix of sympathy and sharp commentary. Some said the picture would look good in columns about redemption. Others said nothing would absolve the damage done. Amanda did not look at the headlines. She sat in her kitchen and watched Philip pour milk carefully into a cup. His small, precise gestures, the grammar of someone learning to belong. Peter laughed at the sound the milk made, and then reached for Philip's hand. Amanda leaned against the counter, and let the two small hands in the frame be her measure of recovery. There were conversations Amanda still had to have. About the legacy, about the way power can warp compassion, about her own capacity to forgive. Elena would be part of those conversations not in the house, but in courtrooms and in the long bureaucratic motions of appeals. Amanda felt no rush to be magnanimous. Her priority was the children and the quiet, patient rebuilding of trust. The nights remained difficult. Amanda woke sometimes to the sensation of not knowing which memory belonged to truth. She would find Peter sleeping with a small leather toy his father had given him, or a drawing Philip had made of a house with two sons. She learned to read the boys as each other read them, without the elegant maps wealth could buy, but with the much harder currency of intimacy. Over time, the instinct to repair hardened into practice. She made sure therapy was not a show, but an ongoing commitment. She hired teachers who could work with Philip's hunger and specialists who could help Peter navigate a world that would sometimes be unkind. Jacob and Amanda built a life together that was different than either had expected. They were not unmarried lovers in some romantic script. They were co-parents learning the practical, often unromantic acts of life. Bathing schedules, school registration, reprimanding the boys for minor thefts of cookies. They were also sometimes lovers in a quiet, stubborn way, sitting on a patio in the summer, and watching the sky like two people who had survived storms and decided, finally, to plant a small garden anyway. In a private moment that summer, Amanda walked into the study and found Eleanor waiting, unescorted and plainly altered. She had been released on bail while her appeals were litigated, her public composure further affected by legal costs and private introspection. The conversation that followed was not theatrical in the way Amanda had once imagined such a meeting might be. It was a private, blunt accounting. "Mother," Elena said, the word stripped of the habitual hauteur. Amanda regarded her. There was no mercy in her face that would absolve wrongdoing, and there was also no relish in condemnation. She had suffered losses and had given herself to repair. "What do you need, Elena?" Elena swallowed. "I wanted to say I am sorry," she said. "I thought I was protecting you. I made terrible choices. I didn't sensibly justify it then, and I cannot now." Her voice broke on the last word, and the admission, though late, sounded honest in its rawness. Amanda listened. She had been schooled in the calculus of apology. She had also watched many apologies offered as instruments. This one sounded different, because it lacked performance. Eleanor's eyes were wet, her posture less rigid. "I'm not asking for absolution," Elena continued. "I'm asking for a chance to do what I can to make this right. I do not expect forgiveness." Amanda could see that Elena was smaller, not merely physically, but in the way someone shrinks from the gravity of their acts. After a long moment, Amanda sat and reached for her daughter's hand. The hold was not warm in the way of the old times. It was cool and pragmatic. "You must answer to the law," she said. "There's no other ledger that matters now. But if you want to work, volunteer, help with the fund, go to the orphanage and teach, then do it. Not because it will fix everything, but because repair requires labor." Elena nodded. The exchange did not pivot the world back to any prior symmetry. It was only a small, real step. Months slid by with hearings and small legal motions. Some people lost their reputations. Some simply kept the harm in private and hid from the press. The city moved to other outrages and other dramas as it always did. But in the Okoro house, the daily life of two boys slowly stitched new seams. Philip learned to draw with a careful hand and wrote notes to Amanda with the seriousness of a scholar. Peter, who could not see the lines Philip drew, memorized their shapes and named them aloud. The boys made up a language of small rituals, a way to hide 2 coins in a vent and then find them, a game of labeling rooms by feel. Amanda watched these rituals with a strange and abiding gratitude. One late afternoon, when the sky had the copper light of late summer and the garden smelled of cut grass, Amanda sat on a bench while Philip played with the cat, and Peter followed him with an exhilaration that was not inhibited by sight. Jacob came and sat beside her, his hands stained faintly with grease from a minor repair he had done in the greenhouse. He put his arm around her shoulder in a practiced move that was now almost simple. They did not speak for a while. "You did the right thing," Jacob said eventually. "Keeping both of them. That was the only thing that made sense to me." Amanda leaned her head on his shoulder and watched the boys. "It's not the only thing," she said quietly. "But it's the one I could live with." Jacob smiled, and it was the sort of smile that had learned how to be honest. "We will teach them how to be honest too," he said. "That's something I can help with." The city had its final outlines of consequence: Dr. Adme's service ban, Chisholm's and Emma's community sentences and fines, Elena's suspended appeal burning slowly through appeals court. The legal processes would wind on in the background like a slow machine. Amanda's life, far from the tidy ending tabloids enjoy, became a long, patient occupation. She put resources behind the orphanage and brought in consultants to improve identification at hospitals. She sat with her sons and taught them to speak of truth as an act rather than a virtue. In the evenings, when both boys were asleep, and the house settled into the long sigh of old walls, Amanda would sometimes go to Peter's room and, for a while, sit in the dark and let her fingers press the small maps of the child's palms. She thought of the strange arithmetic of motherhood, that love could be firm on both claims and that the heart could hold contradictions. She had been robbed of certainty. She had not been robbed of the capacity to respond. On the small anniversaries, birthdays, the day they had recovered Philip, the family did not host parties. They ate at home, with boiled rice and baked fish, and a cake that was modest and not meant for the tabloids. The boys blew out candles like admirals setting sail. Amanda watched them and felt, in the same small instant, the tug of memory and the forward pull of the ordinary. The last image the city would frame of Amanda's household for a long while was not a courtroom drama, but a private tableau. The two boys at the kitchen table, drawing by touch and bickering about which book belonged to whom. Peter, reaching across, found Philip's hand and squeezed it the way a small person might squeeze a rope to test the pull. Philip looked up and smiled a slow, secret smile that seemed older than his years. Amanda, watching from the doorway, had the look of a woman who had weathered a storm and decided finally to keep the light on. There would be more hearings, more lawyers, more columns. Elena's legal fate would be argued for months, her appeals a testament to the way privilege warps due process into endurance. But those were legal contortions that public life could untangle in the future. In the immediate sphere of the house, the work was simpler and harder. To love, to heal, to protect. If you were in Amanda's place, facing the reality that the child you raised might not be your blood, yet being bound to that child's life, what would you choose? Would you privilege biology or the daily truths of care? Share what you think below, and if you want to follow this family's next steps, the trial, the slow rebuilding, the echoes of consequence, subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.